Additionally, underestimating the Sigma male is one of the worst mistakes you can make. Silent yet deadly, it is the nature of Sigma males. They are frequently overlooked, and this is a mistake you wish to avoid. They are extraordinarily clever and dedicated, not because they are physically powerful. Giving Sigma male a cause to shoot at you is the last thing you want to do. This is not to argue that Sigma males are by nature evil. They are so understanding and calm. But, you risk being burnt if you attempt to tread on their tail. Nothing is more perilous than a Sigma male with a grudge. Here are 12 reasons why Sigma is the most dangerous breed. Number 12, Sigma males are excellent at persuading and understanding people. Working with a Sigma male differs from working with a regular person. Sigma males are excellent at reading individuals and figuring out their motivations. Sigma males with this quality are dangerous because they know just when to press the correct buttons to get what they want. Most of the time, they succeed in achieving their goals in the end. This skill comes in handy while obtaining information from other people. The extraordinary probing abilities of a Sigma male sometimes result in accidental revelations. It is useless to try to trick them or hide anything from them since they have intelligence that is above trickery. When a Sigma male is tricked, they will pretend to believe to predict what will happen next. Although their passive behavior gives the appearance of controlled authority, they are the ones holding the strings. He wishes to push you to the edge. When faced with deceit, the Sigma male uses reverse psychology rather than anger. Despite appearances, he is still in command. He is far more adept at subtly manipulating situations than anybody else. Number 11, they voice their opinions without fear. Sigma males don't hesitate to express who they are. Even when they disagree with others, they are honest and upfront in their thought process. They are always forthright and honest, getting right to the point. They will give you their honest opinion if you ask for it, even if it isn't what you were expecting to hear. Never think that just because you attempt to convince Sigma males to do something, they will comply. This is a foolish idea. They won't just agree with you without providing a valid argument. Whether or not it will hurt their feelings, they will always tell you the truth. They will give you their honest assessment, even if it isn't what you had anticipated. Some people might find this level of honesty strange or unsettling. But if you stick with it, you'll find that Sigma men are trustworthy and dependable people. Number 10, Sigma males are incredibly self-controlling and never lose their composure under pressure. Sigma males never let their feelings control them. Whether they are having a heated fight or someone has just insulted them, they will never allow their emotions to get the better of them. Their ability to maintain composure and reason makes them extremely dangerous enemies. It is difficult to trigger a Sigma male when you are in their presence. Anything they are not willing to do, they won't do. They never allow their emotions to get in the way of their judgment and always maintain control over the situation. They are excellent leaders because of this. They are admired and respected since they don't let their feelings influence their decisions. Number 9, Sigma males are highly rational characters. They are among the most rational individuals you will ever meet because they don't let feelings get in the way of their judgment. They always use reason and sound reasoning as the foundation for their decisions. Engaging in an argument with a Sigma male will reveal that their answers are consistently backed up by reason. It is not a good idea to try to persuade them with emotional arguments. A Sigma male cannot be won over with feelings. You have to be able to provide reasoning and proof for your statements if you want their respect. If not, they'll think you're a manipulator. As a result, they will either ignore you or, worse yet, show you how powerful they are. Number 8, your weaknesses are readily apparent to them. Your weaknesses can be readily detected by Sigma males' keen observers. They pay significant attention to their environment and have excellent recall. Even if you think you have avoided their notice, they will take revenge on you when you least expect it, even if they behave as though they have forgotten. They are skilled at waiting for the right opportunity to attack. It seems as though they can recall every utterance and action you've ever committed. They will so ensure that you pay the price if you make a significant error. Sigma male has either moved on or forgiven you if it has been a while since he last touched you. You can count yourself lucky, but if he's that attached to it, he'll find a method to vent his frustration. Even if they sometimes commit an error against them, Sigma males are forgiving and do not waste their energy on unworthy people. They may, however, also be quite vindictive if you seriously wrong them. Instead of using physical force, they manipulate your thoughts to make you unaware of what has occurred. Number 7, their planning is excellent. Have you ever played a game against a Sigma male? If so, you are aware that they consistently plan by 20 steps. They always plan and take into account all potential outcomes. They are difficult to defeat since they have previously considered every possibility. They constantly appear to be a few steps ahead of you and are skilled at reading your movements. He is a powerful opponent since he is constantly prepared for any circumstance. It's never a smart idea to cross a Sigma male since they always seem to come out on top. They appear to be hiding something, which turns off a lot of people. It's preferable to be amicable and prevent disputes. Number 6, Sigma males are frequently the quiet watchers in the group, but that doesn't mean they aren't involved in the conversation. Despite their lack of speech, they are always attentive and learning new things. Always looking, always observing. They learn insightful things about the world around them as a result of this. There is more to them than meets the eye, so don't undervalue their degree of awareness. Should you ever provoke a Sigma male, be prepared for the possible consequences. It is important to consider what they already know about you before acting. Male Sigma males are always plotting, however, other people could just go along with things. They are always considering the best strategy to achieve their goals. This characteristic makes them difficult to defeat since they are constantly one step ahead. You could be at a disadvantage if you ever compete against a Sigma male. He'll already have figured out how to take you out. They are always looking for methods to outperform their competitors. Number 5, the Sigma male is excellent at hiding his genuine intentions. He won't share his thoughts with others when he feels threatened, making it challenging to figure out what his goals are. He's difficult to deal with since it's difficult to predict his next move because he's always planning and skilled at taking advantage of circumstances. He likes to keep people confused and wondering. Although he maintains his composure and calm on the outside, a lot is going on behind his look. The Sigma male is more subdued when upsetting others, in contrast to the alpha male who is more forthright. Number 4, Sigma males are incredibly strong and driven people. There aren't many individuals as stubborn as Sigma males. They endure the most trying circumstances. They always figure out a way around anything that stands in their way. They can achieve because they have the willpower to do so. Their goals are usually ambitious, and they strive tirelessly to achieve them. They keep trying, no matter how many times they fail. They always manage to get back up and try again. They are warriors with a strong will. Beware of a Sigma male who is true to their ambitions. A lengthy struggle is to be expected if you encounter one. He is going to keep going till he wins. They also have a strong drive to fulfill their goals. He will do whatever it takes to ruin you if you get on his wrong side. They are therefore risky to deal with in both personal and professional contexts. He will go to any lengths to achieve his goals if he makes up his mind to do so. However, if he likes you, he will go above and above to support you in realizing your goals. Everyone is resilient and determined, but Sigma male possesses exceptional resilience and resolve. This makes them distinct from the others. You should thus use caution with Sigma male since you can never be sure. Number 3, you will get away with it, but they will always remember. Sigma males have excellent memory and are not easily forgetful. There are benefits and drawbacks to this. They will recall prior transgressions from you, but they will also recall your positive interactions. They will follow you for the rest of their lives if you can gain their trust. They won't forget it, though, if you wrong them. Sigma male can be emotional even when they don't show it. They may find it challenging to let go of the past as a result. You might be able to get away with it, but no one will ever forget what you did. The game ends if you make another mistake. They will remove you from your life and remind you of all your previous transgressions if they occur. They look indifferent, but they are quite emotional, though they are good at hiding it. It's important to use caution when among Sigma males. You may think you've played them, but they know everything and are just waiting for the right opportunity to let you know they know what you're doing. Number 2, Sigma males will not stand for betrayal. It will not go over well if a Sigma male is purposefully wronged, particularly on a subject that matters to them. You may think you can avoid the repercussions, but he will reveal the truth about you. Though it might not happen immediately, he will make sure you regret stepping on him. The Sigma male is not a cruel guy, despite his seeming vindictiveness. He just doesn't like individuals who deliberately irritate him. He would want to keep to himself and avoid any disturbance. However, if you continue to annoy him, he won't think twice about stepping in and taking over. He acts as though he is in a competition and won't give up until he succeeds. Whether it's at the office, in his personal life, or on the internet, he'll make sure you understand that what you did is improper. Sigma males will not accept it. Though you might have thought you could beat him, you'll quickly realize how wrong you were. Number 1, Sigma males are experts at disguising themselves. Despite their desire to blend in and not bring attention to themselves, they are quite influential and strong. They take full advantage of this underlying depth that most people are unable to comprehend. Guys are not the same as Sigma males. They defy conventions and accepted wisdom. They create their own. They are resourceful and flexible in addition to being autonomous and self-sufficient. They never really belong, yet they can blend in any place. They always have one foot ahead of the game, always strategizing and preparing, and always prepared for anything. Sigma males are difficult to comprehend or forecast. They take pleasure in their enigmatic and secretive nature. They never disclose their actual intentions or sentiments and play the cards very close to the chest. They don't show off their intelligence or cunning, though they are incredibly smart. They don't show it, but they are incredibly ambitious and motivated. They don't need it, yet they exude charm and confidence. Anyone who wishes to resist or get close to a Sigma male faces the greatest hurdle. They always manage to surprise you and are not who they appear. There's more to Sigma males than meets the eye. They are the unseen power that shapes reality. That's all for today. Thank you for being a part of this community. If you find this video informative, hit the like button, share with your friends and subscribe to the channel for more Sigma male videos. See you in the next video on your screen.